Millions will understandably be feeling shortchanged as a result.
MacAskill.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As other speakers have said, I think there's always something in a budget to commend and some things that are admirable. It's the totality that requires to be looked at, and it's not simply the headline figures that are announced by the Chancellor, but indeed the drill-down figures that will come around in days to come that will be the analysis of it. Carbon capture and storage is to be welcomed, but the question remains, why not in Scotland and in the North Sea, that has something like 30% of Europe's capacity, given the geology of it? Prepayment meters are quite rightly being levied. That has been mentioned by many speakers. But why hasn't that been done to date? All it required was a letter to Ofgem directing them, a ministerial letter that could have been sent and should have been sent before winter came, because it's still snowing in Scotland and people are freezing. And this should have been dealt with a long time ago, as well as other aspects of energy that haven't been touched upon. Upon new technology, again there are welcome announcements, but where's the announcements on hydrogen or on long storage battery duration? The situation there is that we have over 17% of our turbine capacity in the UK, not just in Scotland, turned off. Not because the winds aren't turning, but because the national grid doesn't have capacity. There is a solution to that. It is to store it, it is to use it, and that's why you need battery storage, that's why you need hydrogen. And as we see with the conflict in ammonia, you can also get ammonia from it, the conflict in Ukraine. So those aspects should have been considered. But as I say, this has to be looked in the round. And I think what the budget does show is that there is wealth in the society. What I want to consider is where that wealth is coming from and to whom it is largely going, because the situation remains that Scotland is energy rich, and yet the majority of Scots are going to find themselves fuel poor. The oil and gas wealth that we were told in 2014 was all but gone and simply a burden upon poor Scotland if we went independent is now crux and being used with great effect by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Being added to that is the situation of offshore wind, and yet at the same time fuel poverty still continues to scar Scotland, not just rural but urban areas. There was no mention of unregulated fuels, and yet the situation remains that some 8% of people in Scotland are dependent upon unregulated fuels, where the cost has been even greater than that of gas and electricity, and no steps have been taken to address it. There has been no steps taken to address those who live off the gas grid and where poverty is worsened in terms of fuel poverty, because they either require to depend upon unregulated fuels, or in urban areas because they are often in 1960s multi-storey flats or other tenements where gas cannot be provided. They're dependent upon all electric supplies that are usually most costly and indeed ineffective in terms of providing warmth. What arrangements have been made for them? Why couldn't the alternative fuel funding be made available for them? Because they are in clear need, and that should have been extended. So we needed support for those unregulated fuels and indeed for those who are all electric and living in urban and indeed rural deprived areas. And there remains the question of the social tariff that has been trailed by the government, but we still not have seen an announcement. That is something that is provided by other countries across the world, especially in the European continent, and it's about time that we actually saw a social tariff delivered here for those who are most vulnerable. In terms of support for the poorest, we aren't seeing that. We are seeing very wealthy pensioners provided for. But just earlier this week, there was a meeting at which research was provided by the Joseph Russell Roundtree Trust and indeed the Trussell Trust, pointing out that in this country we have always had, since the inception of the welfare state, the belief that there should be a safety net below which nobody should go. It was initially supplementary benefit. It's now meant to be provided by universal credit, whether you're in work or in receipt of a pension. And yet the situation that we face now in our society is that it is not providing the basic essentials for humans to survive. The basic essentials, leaving aside the need for people to deal with emergencies, the deal to deal with a debt crisis that might arrive, it just simply doesn't allow for day-to-day living. The shortfall is £35 per week for a single person, £66 for a married couple. The fact of the matter is people in this country are going under, and yet the only people being rewarded out of this budget are those who have the greatest wealth, whether to invest further in pensions or pass it on to those who will benefit from the wealth that they've accrued. The society has to be judged by how it looks after its poorest and most vulnerable. And all of this, of course, occurs in a country that is energy rich. We are talking about Scots, probably the majority of Scots, over half of our population, being in fuel poverty. Whole areas are going to be existing in fuel poverty. And yet Scotland's energy wealth is being used by the UK to make the rich richer. Scotland's wealth is being extracted and our people are being left bereft. It's not just the oil and gas that I mentioned earlier. Let's look at what's anticipated to come from the renewable energy, because I did ask Basis a question about what energy was going to be provided from Scotland south of the border. I'm told that at the present moment what's going south is 35 terawatts. Now, I had to say and confess that I had to investigate what a terawatt was, because I've heard of a kilowatt, I've heard of a megawatt, and I've heard of a gigawatt. I didn't know what a terawatt was. A terawatt is 1 billion kilowatts. The average household in Scotland uses 4,000 kilowatts per annum. Scotland is sending 35 terawatts south, and by 2030, BASE anticipate that Scotland will be providing 124 terawatts. That's 124 billion kilowatts of electricity. And our people are freezing as I speak. People are unable to power their homes. Our energy is being taken. You took our oil and gas. You're seeking to take our offshore and onshore wind. It is simply unacceptable. This budget enriches those who are already rich in England. It is exploiting the natural benefit and bounty that Scotland has, and it is further impoverishing the poor people in Scotland, as it is the poor people across the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.